So you believe, like Peter Webb, that an Abrahamic origin for the Kaaba was never claimed by the Arabs prior to Islam. We have no onomastic data, no epigraphic evidence, no pre-Islamic poetry that demonstrates that that was the case.
Yes, I do. Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you think the Prophet was the first to make this claim?
Yes.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to the Real Talk podcast with your hosts, Tehran and Roxana. Today, we have a fascinating topic with a guest we've previously interviewed, but has graciously accepted a second invitation to discuss his recent article, The Quran as a Historical Source. A link to the article is in the description, but please welcome Mr. James Howard-Johnston. Thank you, sir, for joining us. All right, and your article was a thought-provoking one. Even if one doesn't agree with its thesis, which we'll discuss later, it offers much to consider about a major turning point in early Islamic history and how this single event contributed greatly to Islam's early success. But first, what motivated a respected historian like yourself, known for expertise in Byzantine history, to explore the Quran as a historical source? Some people might say that's a little out of place.
I was writing a book on the last great war of antiquity between the East Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, which occurred in the early 7th century, and was immediately followed by the Arab conquest of the Persian Empire and much of the East Roman Empire. So obviously, the Arabs and Islam came within my field of vision, and the Quran, as I argue in my article, it doesn't need to be argued, is the most important single document to survive from the 7th century.
You've said that any historian of the Middle East in the 7th century must pay careful attention to the Quran, both qua evidence and qua motor of change. What do you feel that the Quran can tell us that other historical sources cannot?
Well, it gets us as close as one could be to the Prophet in his lifetime. And given that the Prophet is, and what he said, transformed the world, one simply has to get to grips with it.
And you've talked about a chronological reading of the Quran. You've recommended in the past to read the Quran in chronological order in terms of revelation, alongside the Sirah. How does that reading of the text change our understanding of how it can function as a historical source?
I mean, to establish the chronological order, there are various criteria, and a wonderful historian of the Quran, Nicholas Saniai, has explained them. So basically, if one is reading them in chronological order, basically it's the opposite to the canonical order. The earliest very, very short surahs they're very short, they're very, very powerful. And then you end up with the longest of all, Al-Baqarah, the cow, surah number 2. How does it help one? Well, it allows one to basically watch and hear, basically listen as the Prophet speaks through time, and one can see what were the dominant themes and dominant concerns at particular times, and how they evolve. So, I mean, my view on that, which I think is the view of anyone reading it, is that you start with an apocalyptic vision of the end of time and the coming judgment, and then it sort of calms down to start arguing for a series of positive things, and then towards the end, negative arguments, polemics against Jews and Christians. So one has a sense of the development of the development of the message through time. As basically it starts as something to shake everyone, and ends up by sort of gripping hold of everyday life and producing many prescriptions for how to live. It's almost a law code.
And one of those changes that you see happening in the Quran, or one of the evolutions that it features, which your essay, what you talk about in your essay, in your view, the changing of the Qibla was a key moment in the development of Islam as a new faith. Why, in your view, is this moment so significant?
Because the new direction of the Qibla, which is the current direction of the Qibla, was to Mecca and to the Kaaba in Mecca. And most people, I think almost everyone, thinks that the Qibla previously pointed towards the holy city of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, namely Jerusalem. So that shift is an extraordinary shift. You see, for a monotheist religion, and the most monotheist of all, to shift from the holy city to what was at the time a pagan cult center. Quite extraordinary.
Some other scholars have posited that the changing of the Qibla was principally about heralding the formation of the Prophet's community as a separate community from the Jews and Christians that were around him. What is your view on that thesis?
Well, it's certainly true that with the passage of time and with opposition coming from Jews, or at any rate differences occurring with Jews, we hear much less about Christians we hear virtually nothing about Christians in the Sirah. The prophet starts, you can see him distancing the new religion from the representatives, local representatives of the old religions. But still, it's a most extraordinary move to move from the holy city. Given that the prophet acknowledged that both the Old Testament and the New Testament were divine revelation, to move from the holy city to a pagan center is quite extraordinary.
And you've said that you believe that the prophetic Sirah largely reflects historical reality. How were you led to that conclusion, and why do you make an exception in relation to the dating of the changing of the Qibla?
It's a very, very good question. The answer is that in a book which was published 14 years ago of mine called Witnesses to a World Crisis, that book, in a sense, was designed to basically produce a sort of template of information about the 7th century, and in particular about 7th century Arabia, and then to see how the Sirah fared against it. And basically on, I think I enumerate 5 historical events which are documented in sources, reliable sources written outside Arabia. We can see that what the Sirah has to say about those events basically tallies. I mean, notably about the persecution of Jews by Yusuf in Yemen, and in the 520s, and then about the Persian takeover of Yemen in the 570s, and there are intervening events. So I mean, I was already, before I started this, I was pretty convinced of the reality of the Sirah after reading it, and it makes good sense. But what one needed to do was to show that for matters that can't be corroborated from outside, basically the life of the Prophet and the early history of the Ummah, that it was embedded in a generally reliable text. Now, why is it unreliable on some things? and in particular on the kibla. Well, I shouldn't say why is it unreliable. How can one show that it's unreliable? What suggests that that particular it's actually a single sentence in the Sirah is out of place? Well, because it doesn't tally with the Quran. That's the basic reason. But the second reason is that it's just a single sentence. There's no elaboration about it. And if the Sirah had been sort of transformed later, there would have been an enormous amount of elaboration introduced. But it's a single sentence. And it seems to me that obviously the Quran trumps the Sirah.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah.
And you know what? I went and looked at the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, if that's the one that you referred to, and you are right in this. Well, you're right in a sense. It does refer to the changing of the Qibla in two places. One place, it mentions it, and it seems a bit out of place. And it's only like a single sentence, and then it goes on to something else about how the hypocrites or maybe the Jews of Medina had criticized the Prophet about the Qibla, and then it goes on to something else. But then it mentions it maybe like 50 pages later with another maybe single or a couple sentences, and it says it almost as like a by the way. Some other people say that the Qibla was changed 17 months after the Hijrah in the month of Shaban.
Yeah.
And even you're right, it doesn't provide any context to that. It doesn't give any explanation. Even in the first bit where it mentions 50 pages earlier, it still doesn't give any which is kind of a bit strange. Why that's so, which gives a little bit of not credibility, but lends a bit of support to your theory that hey, maybe this thing was misplaced for whatever reason.
In particular, what is it about the chronology of the Quran that leads you to believe that the changing of the Qibla was 6 years later than what the Sirah says, and that it is concurrent with the institution of Hajj and the association of the Kaaba with Abraham? Why do you think that all of those things were a late Medinan development?
Well, the basic reason is that on the sort of received chronological reordering of the Quran, those three phenomena, change of Qibla, institution of Hajj, and the attribution of the founding of the Kaaba to Abraham only feature in basically three very late surahs, namely surahs basically 2, 22, and 5. Those are the main ones. Also surah 3. The key to all of this is the dating of individual surahs. So yes, my whole argument collapses if that goes. But then it becomes very, very hard to make sense of the development of the Prophet's speaking as we go through it. Because Surah 2, which is very, very long, basically it's producing a law code for the new community, and that is something which one would expect to happen at a very late stage when you're sorting out all sorts of practicalities. So it rests entirely on the argument that I present in the paper rests entirely on the dating of the surahs of the Quran. But there was a second reason, and that was a reason that this happened after I'd already was pretty convinced about it. And the second reason is that we do know from the Sirah, and I've got general faith in the Sirah, that 6 years after the Hijrah, that Muhammad went with some companions towards Mecca, and in the hope of going on the Umrah. Now, we then know that discussions took place. And then according to the Sirah then refers to the agreement that was made and to certain phrases in the agreement, the wording which referred to the prophet by his patronymic, not as a prophet. That was the Quraysh insisted on that, and the prophet yielded. And secondly, referred to God as Allah, one of the gods of Mecca, rather than as Al-Rahman, as the compassionate, as Muhammad wished them to refer to it. Now that suggested to me years and years ago that the outcome of those negotiations, which very much favored Mecca on the as it's presented in the Sirah, that one couldn't make sense of it because the Meccans made two huge concessions. One, they said the prophet could go on pilgrimage in a year's time, and two, that the prophet, three concessions. Second, that the warfare would stop for 10 years, and third, that the prophet could communicate with the other tribes in Arabia. So one had to ask oneself, what on earth induced the Quraysh to make this deal in which they made these huge concessions?
And
then what seemed to me the obvious answer was the prophet, by going on the Umrah, was indicating that Mecca was going to be a central place in the new religion.
And I wonder if, okay, so the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah happened after the siege of the ditch. So, so I wonder if the Quraysh were just that confident, as you mentioned, that the siege of the ditch wasn't meant to kind of destroy the Muslim Ummah, but more like I can't remember the word, minuet or a ballet, a dance of some sort, in order to demonstrate the power of the Meccan elite. I wonder if they were confident because of that demonstration of power that the other tribes of Arabia would have seen the religion of Islam at that time as weak and insignificant, and so they made these concessions because they had no faith that the religion would spread any further after that bout that they had with them. So yeah, I really tried to think deeply about why the Quraysh would make such concessions, and I granted your point, but also tried to think, what could also be some other reasons. And I like how you mentioned that the Quraysh weren't intending to destroy but a demonstration of power. And I thought maybe that demonstration of power was they thought was enough in order to kind of quell the growth of the religion at the time.
If they did think that, I mean, they were absolutely wrong because I mean, I think it's obvious to any person open-minded reading the Quran that it is that many of the things said absolutely fit the landscape of Arabia. And here was a whole sort of conception of earth and heaven, and that was particularly well attuned. So they would have been appallingly wrong, but of course, and of course, as we see, because the outcome is within 2 years, the balance has shifted absolutely decisively in favor of the exiled Ummah. But even if they thought that, one still has to find, whether there clearly was something that triggered the negotiations, and that is recorded in the Hijra, and that was Muhammad aiming to go on the pilgrimage. And so that, I think, provides another piece of evidence that the change, because to disassociate the change in the kibla from the Hajj, I think that's quite hard, given that they are conjoined in the relevant surahs. And given that, I mean, they are sort of logically so connected. So as you see, my thesis is that the shift of the kibla and occurred and was declared before the prophet tried to go on the pilgrimage to justify it to the believers who might have had serious doubts about this act if it wasn't supported by a declaration.
Okay, so that's an excellent segue into why do you think the prophet saw it as so important to anchor the cultic aspects of Islam in his community's descent from Abraham and Ishmael? I mean, why do you think so much emphasis is placed on biblical genealogy in the Quran as a whole?
Well, basically because the Old Testament, well, the Old Testament is obviously it's got many more similarities than the New Testament with the Quran, and there are many more citations of the Old Testament and of Old Testament figures than of the New Testament. Basically, because the Old Testament, a lot of it takes place in a similar sort of environment, and the New Testament takes place in a Roman province, ordered, urbanized, etc. I would say that the I'm straying away from your ask the question again. I'm straying away from the
Oh, sorry, let me just pull it back up. Why do you think the prophet saw it so important to anchor the cultic aspects of Islam in his community's descent from Abraham and Ishmael?
Right. Well, it's because well, he was doing so from the start. I mean, it's clearly that there are Jewish influences in the air and some of the things that he picks up. So he was doing that anyway. So Abraham and other Old Testament prophets, above all Moses, feature often in the surahs of the Quran. And so I think it's just part that this was the third revelation. There'd been two before. It was the third one. It was the one that completed the previous two. I mean, I don't necessarily see from the Quran itself that it was precluding any further direct inspiration from God. That it was that there couldn't be mystics, and there couldn't be great, ayatollah, like Shi'i ayatollahs, directly inspired by God. But clearly, it's the third great revelation, following two other great revelations.
Definitely. So him instituting Abraham and Ismail, if maybe lack of better terminology, is consistent with the Quranic message from the beginning. It's not something that just happened.
Oh yes, indeed. Oh yes, indeed. No, Abraham is absolutely, one of the absolute sort of giant figures of the past, presented as such in the Quran, long before this particular these late surahs.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And there seems to be a strong ritual continuity between the way Hajj was practiced pre and post Islam, including circumambulation, the pilgrim's dress, shaving hair, and animal sacrifice. In your article, you observed that, quote, a pagan sacrifice was transformed into a monotheistic ritual by the attitude with which it was carried out, end quote. How would you describe that change of attitude? Why do you think the prophet did not espouse, let's say, a discourse that the Hajj needed significant alteration to cleanse it from polytheism?
Well, that is one of the most extraordinary sort of phenomena that one comes across. I mean, clearly, well, he does wish it to be cleansed from all idol worship. So that crucial thing, that's the absolute crucial thing, with the object of it all, to what was the veneration being paid, and it should be paid just to the one supreme, all-knowing, all-powerful God. So that's the all-important thing. As regards the rituals, I mean, it is very striking the way they are taken over. Above all, blood sacrifice, and obviously it created problems for Islam later when Christians sort of learnt about it and started sort of mocking it a bit. So it was an extraordinary thing to do, but I think so it needs explaining, and so I try to give the explanation in terms of the power on earth at that time of the Quraysh at Mecca on the one hand and the Ummah at Medina on the other, and it was very, very uneven. And so it's not simply the Hajj, it's not simply the change of the kibla and the approval of the Hajj. It is, as you say, the preservation of so many of the rituals associated with the Hajj, which is absolutely extraordinary. And I should say, yesterday I came across a German journal called Millennium. I mean, I was catching up with it, but it's 2023 issue, and it has a set of 5 articles at the start on the Quran, epigraphy, pre-Islamic poetry in Arabia, and the conclusion of Peter Webb on who's looking at the poetry and early hadith is the same as mine, which is that the association of the Kaaba with Abraham was basically very late, and you don't find it in the pre-Islamic poetry, or indeed in the inscriptions, such as refer to it, but you only find it in the hadith afterwards. So it first appears in these few very late surahs in the Quran.
So you believe, like Peter Webb, that an Abrahamic origin for the Kaaba was never claimed by the Arabs prior to Islam. We have no onomastic data, no epigraphic evidence, no pre-Islamic poetry that demonstrates that was the case.
Yes, I do. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you think the Prophet was the first to make this claim?
Yes, and at this particular time, in order to justify what seemed to be an extraordinary religious political act, namely shifting the orientation of the new monotheistic faith being propagated among Arabs initially, but intended for the world at large, that it should focus on a particular structure, which was a pagan structure in Mecca, by Mecca.
You know, I have to say, Webb's article is one that we read in preparation for this interview.
Oh, we both prepared for the same things, right?
And you know, he's also been a guest.
Well, I read it.
He's also been a guest on our platform twice. You know,
he's a good scholar. Yes,
definitely. I enjoy much of his work.
In terms of sort of chronicling the connection of Islam with Abraham and Ishmael, what do the earliest non-Muslim sources that chronicle the emergence of Islam, like the history of Khosrov that you talked about in your book, what do they tell us about how Jews and Christians regarded the Muslim claim that the Prophet and his followers descended from Abraham and Ishmael? And can they tell us anything about at which point Arabians began conceptualizing their origins as Abrahamic descendants from Ishmael?
I think I have to say that that's a very hard question for a non-Islamist. I mean, it's the sort of question I mean, Peter Bell will be able to give a proper answer to. But the contemporary sources clearly acknowledge that this this claim was it was widespread, and it was not denounced in the outside world. I mean, what the history of Khosrow is talking about is the way that it was then used as a justification or a motivation for entry into the Holy Land itself. But I think it's taken as a it's a given about the Arabs in certain sources which are attuned to religious matters. So I think there's nothing surprising about it. That's not something that the prophet, as it were, introduced. I think it's something that's there in the background and which he picks up. And there were, of course, large Jewish communities in Arabia before. And there was a sense of, and then a shifting from polytheism to henotheism, to the sense of there being a single great God presiding over everything. Well, you are. My God, you're briefed. You're briefed.
And just spinning back to the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, why was this moment a political masterstroke for the Prophet? I mean, how does it relate to the wider regional success of Islam after his death?
Well, it basically, the blockade of the Ummah at Medina, basically isolating them from the wider world of Arabia, was lifted. And then the message, and I mean, and its extraordinary power was able to be propagated, and that did transform. I mean, not all Arabs turned into immensely pious Muslims immediately, but the process was started, and within the lifetime of the Prophet, of course, the numerous tribes throughout Arabia, particularly in the south, present their, as it were, their credentials and submit.
What, in your view, were the historical consequences of expanding Hajj from a very localized ritual, which was followed primarily by groups just living near Mecca, into sort of a pan-Arabian phenomenon with an intimate role in informing communal identity of Muslims and obviously political power?
Well, I think you've said you've said it yourself. Once it's opened, the only thing I mean, the article which we both read, referring to pre-Islamic inscriptions, I think may unduly restrict the zone of pilgrimage looking to the Kaaba, and I say so basically because the Quran gives a rather different impression. So I would envisage the Kaaba being very much the pilgrimage center for the Hijaz and for some elsewhere, basically because of the mercantile connections of Mecca. So I think it's already on the rise, but it becomes basically the universal pilgrimage center after 628.
And that perfectly leads to our next question. I mean, how much do you accept the Sirah's depiction of Mecca as a city that economically and politically dominated the Hijaz in the late 6th century? This is like one comment we constantly get on our YouTube channel, that, oh, we don't have any archaeological evidence, we don't have any real historical evidence for Mecca being any kind of trade center. And while I concede to the fact that maybe Mecca wasn't as big as it was described in the Sirah, I'm pretty confident that it seemed to have been a bustling trade center, at least within the century before the rise of Islam or the birth of the Prophet of some sort. But just what is your view on that, just to get a historian's take as somebody who's looked at the literature and very familiar with this argument?
Yes, the argument is taken to an extreme by that scholar called Shoemaker, who maintains that Mecca was little more than a village, filled with illiterate peasants. I mean, it seems to me absurd. Well, what are the arguments against it? Well, one, there are all sorts of references to long-distance commerce in the Quran, particularly by sea, as a matter of fact. Secondly, you've got the language of sort of commerce in sense of accounting and so on, again pervading the way that basically sins are sort of tallied up in this life, again in the Quran. So third, you've got the archaeological evidence, and not from Mecca, but from the desert frontage of Palestine and Syria, of a huge boom in the 6th century, precisely the time that it is, that is in the 2 generations before the Prophet's lifetime and carrying on. But third, the Sirah. I mean, I've already given the reasons why I put my trust in the Sirah, unless there are very strong reasons for not doing so. I mean, the general reason is that I cannot conceive of the faithful in the next 1, 2, 3 generations deliberately tampering with memories which I'm sure were deeply imprinted on the collective mind of the main stages of the prophet's life. Before the Hijrah, after the Hijrah, the 3 engagements, the deal, the conquest of Mecca. I can't conceive of that being tampered with, invented, fiction, inconceivable. And the background to it all is a Mecca which has then got complicated deals arranged with the neighboring tribes to secure safe passage of trading caravans to the north. So basically, if one accepts that it's part of the package of the Sirah, and again, how can one make sense of the rapid spread of Islam within Arabia, let alone the rapid conquest of the surrounding world, basically within 20 years of the Prophet's death? Well, unless Mecca was and did have the ramified connections that are indicated in the Sirah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, James. As we wrap up, we just wanted to hear your thoughts on 2 more points. One is obviously, how do you see the study of Byzantine history continuing to contribute to a deeper understanding of Islam? And secondly, what are your views on the importance and potential impact of producing a more contemporary and perhaps even a critical edition of the biography of the Prophet?
Well, most Byzantinists, they're slightly sort of inward looking. So I'm not sure whether any, I mean, I don't think, I mean, the Byzantines are going to make and continue to make a large contribution to understanding the political, diplomatic, military relations between the Caliphate and Byzantium thereafter. Yes. On the origins of Islam, I'm not sure I can think of anybody else who's been doing this sort of thing. And you may ask why I was doing it. Well, we had a subject on the syllabus at Oxford, which was the Near East in the age of Justinian and Muhammad. And it was because I was, after a wonderful, wonderful historian, Peter Brown, who was interested in these subjects, went off first to London, then to America. Teaching it fell to me. And the first thing I did was to read the Quran. In the old edition. So no, I think that the answer to your question is, I think it would be a very small contribution. Now, now your second question, just remind me, there's your second question.
In terms of, what do you see in terms of the potential of producing a contemporary and perhaps even critical edition of the biography of the Prophet?
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. And I mean, a lot of work has been done on it. It certainly should be done to indicate what goes back to Ibn Ishaq and what goes to the Ibn Hisham revision. Then there is the pre-Islamic poetry, you see, and I've always thought that quite a lot of that was authentic. I was very pleased to read Peter Bell. That, of course, has lots of references to trade, but one would like annotation on that. So I think it would be a multi-volume work. It should be accompanied by an English translation, and you'll have volumes of critical commentary on it. It would be wonderful.
I know it would be, and that's something that I desire to see. Sometime, just even know that there's a project being put forth on this subject would be nice to hear. But again, thank you, James, for your time. Your article was a wonderful read. It was thought-provoking. Even though it was very short, it just had us reading so much more just to try to get so much information about the subject, because it was that interesting. And I really hope people inquire, not only watch the interview, but also inquire your work. I mean, you have 2 really good books out there. You might have more, but I own personally Witnesses to a World Crisis and The Last Great World War of Antiquity, which I encourage all of our listeners to read, because they're very useful works to have.
Well, that's very, very generous of you to bought both of them. Anyway, thank you for seeing me again. But I'm quite keen to discover where Roxanne is clearly very, very au fait with things. Did you study Islamic history anyway?
No, I have not. I'm not a scholar at all. I just fascinated by the subjects and just read a lot, but I don't.
Well, you really do. Right. Now, when I've had pupils of all sorts, and I've had Muslim pupils, and so I was thinking that you were like them, but you are a self-educated equivalent of my Oxford pupils. Well, I compliment you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Well, James, I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and try to enjoy some of the weather in the UK while we have it.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
And very nice to meet you, Roxanne. Yes.
Very lovely to meet you too, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon.
Bye.